Have you ever been stuck in a situation where you didn't know what to say? This chapter will help. We're going to study language and verbal communication. My motto for this chapter is just because you think it doesn't mean you need to say it. We should be more cautious and thoughtful of our language use and what we say, because we did learn back in our first chapter that language is or communication is irreversible. You cannot take it back. Once it is out there, it is out there. And so we're going to work on several different areas of verbal communication. We're going to work on the sort of the foundation of language today. I do have a short video clip from Big Bang Theory here that you can play from my PowerPoint that's posted in your folder. They are not playable from this video. And it's short and sweet and to the point, so I do really like that. But let's dive into the foundations of language. I'm going to ask you to reflect on this particular scenario. I want you to imagine that you have to urgently go to the airport, which is 40 miles away, and you need somebody to take you. So you are going to call up your best friend. What are you going to say to them? How are you going to ask them to take you to the airport? What if they weren't available and now you need to ask your boss? Would you word it any differently? Or even a professor? How does your language use change? We do need to work on adapting our language to different scenarios. There are situations, contexts that are more formal or informal. You need to consider the relationship you have with that person. You don't say the same thing to everybody. You should be speaking differently to a young child than you do a romantic partner or your boss or your professor. We need to adapt our language use, and you will become a better communicator if you can start thinking that way. So let's look at what we're covering in this video. We're going to briefly go over the nature of language, that it's powerful, it uses rules, and that it's symbolic. So let's dive in. Language is a formal collection of symbols that have meaning for a particular group of people or a cultural group. We learned about symbols back in our first chapter. If you're not sure about that, you can go back and review that. It's a really important part of our communication. We use verbal and nonverbal symbols, and so our focus is on our verbal communication, right? So it's the exchange of meaning. Our goal is to have shared understanding, and we're going to use written or spoken symbols. That's what we're talking about with verbal communication. So the words that we use are verbal symbols, or sometimes it's referred to as codes. Okay, so let's take a look at how powerful language is. There's an old proverb that says the tongue has the power of life and death. And if we go back in history, we would learn that, Henry VIII could have somebody beheaded because they said so. If they literally had the power of life and death in their hands. We're not kings, so we don't have that authority. Thank goodness. We don't want to do that. But our words can be super powerful or just as powerful. And so we need to reflect on the impact that we have with our language. Remember from our very first chapter that communication is irreversible. You cannot take it back. Even though you say you take it back, I'm going to argue it reveals your character and your heart. You did mean what you said. You may regret the language you used, but it does reveal part of your character. So we do want to pay attention to our language. Back when I was a kid, kids would use this little phrase, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me." I don't know if you've heard that before, or even if you've ever thought about it before, but do you agree with that? Our bones do break, and I had one in kindergarten, a broken bone, and it did hurt, but it healed. But have we ever been hurt by words? I think we can be hurt by words. And because it's irreversible, you can't take it back. So let's remember that our language is powerful. There's a couple of areas that tend to be more obvious as far as powerful language. Racist language, sexist language, even obscene language would also fit into this category. And usually they're intentionally used to suggest inferiority or dominance by a particular culture or member of a culture. But I'm going to suggest to you that a lot of it is just habit now. It's second nature, and you don't really think about that. Maybe you have obscene language, but there are times that are situations that are not appropriate. In a job interview, you should not be using obscene language. And if it's a habit for you, you can't just automatically turn it off. We're not going to be using obscene language, racist language, or sexist language in our speeches. That's not appropriate, nor is it effective. And so there's some of these more obvious types of language use that maybe you would want to start thinking about and reconsidering. But in general, I'd like us to think about how can we be more positive, more encouraging, speak life into one another, encourage one another. We're going to learn how to communicate in ways that we don't have to agree on things, but we can communicate in a way that is polite and respectful and kind. We don't have to be mean about it. And so if we were in a classroom, I'd spend more time on this, but I am grading everything in this class, all of your communication. And so be careful what you type on a discussion board or feedback on a speech. You want to be kind and encouraging. We can mention and suggest ways to improve or ask questions about people's positions or opinions instead of bashing. That's not allowed in my class. No bashing. When you use language, we learn a lot about you because your language can reflect your attitudes. It reflects your personality and your character. So let me give you an example of this. Let's say you went out on a first date and the other person paid for you. Isn't that nice and kind? And we like that, right? So they paid for you, but they used a Groupon, right? For those of you who don't know what a Groupon is, it's a coupon, right? And so you are talking to your friends the next day and they asked how it went and where did you eat, right? They're asking you questions and you mentioned that they used a Groupon. How do they feel about that? What do they say? What's their reaction? Do they say, oh, wow, they're really wise with their money. That's smart. Or I love Groupons. That's great. Oh, they're so thrifty. Or did they say, that's so cheap. I can't believe they used a Groupon on a first date. Right? That is not fabulous. Just by using that word cheap or thrifty, I know a lot about you now. I know about your personality. I've learned a glimpse into who you are just by that one word. So be careful. We can learn a lot about another person just by one single word. No pressure, by the way. We want to work on being more reflective and conscious of our language use, but it will take time. It's not overnight. Language is governed by rules. You know this because you've had English class for many, many years. So you've been introduced to some of these concepts. I'm not going through all of them. It will help clarify a few things. I do want you to know semantics, though, because that gets in the way of some situations. Like if you're in a conflict or even in debates, when you're arguing over the meaning that's assigned to a particular word, right? You're arguing over semantics. In fact, it's almost like a distraction from the main issue. And so when we're arguing over semantics, we're not productive. We're not being effective in our communication. So it can be a negative and it can get in the way of productive conversation, especially if you're in a conflict you're trying to work out. You're going to learn a little bit more about dialects and accents and things like that. Phatic communication is interesting. So you'll just learn a little bit more about rules. It's not the main section of this chapter, but it's important to have a brief understanding of it. The last part of this concept of language and its foundational premises are that it's symbolic, right? So people place meanings in words to interpret or make sense out of those symbols. That goes back to our first chapter, right? So I want to look at it in a little bit of a different way. Okay. Here is a picture of a house, a home, a residence. It could be called a casa, a dwelling. What do you call it, right? There are different names for it, and it can indicate or reflect a little bit about who you are based on what you call it. But when we're talking about using words, they can be divided into two different categories. Our language or our words can be denotative, which is an objective or concrete meaning. It's like our dictionary definition. And then we have concrete connotative or subjective meanings. That would be the personal meaning of a word. And so that may not be as clear as a denotative meaning, but don't be fooled. Denotative meanings can be complex. If you look up the word run in a dictionary, like a full-fledged dictionary, not the smaller electronic dictionaries, you will find over 180 definitions for the word run. And we would think we would all understand what run means, but that may not be the case, even using a denotative meaning. And so, oh, there's our bird. Good morning, Rio. So we do need to be careful. We can't assume that our receiver is going to understand the meaning. Our job is to communicate in a way that allows them to interpret it, hopefully, in the same way as you intend. The bottom line is, it's not the words that have the meaning. It's the people that are interpreting. People place the meaning in the word. The sender places the meaning in the word, and the receiver, the decoder, is interpreting it and trying to understand what you are saying. And hopefully it's the same meaning, but it might not be. Okay, so that's some food for thought. Our next video, we're going to briefly look at culture and gender in terms of language, and then we'll be moving on to troublesome language, some of the problem areas that we have that affect our communication, and explains a lot about misunderstandings. And we're going to dive into a skill that will help us a couple skills that will help us be more clear in our last video.